The morning started like any other. Daniel Carter brewed his coffee, the rich aroma filling his kitchen as he glanced outside. Max, his golden retriever, was lounging in the sun, tail wagging lazily. The sight brought a rare smile to Daniel's face, one of the few things that still did, ever since Sarah passed. Then, the doorbell rang. Daniel opened the door to find a crisp white envelope taped to the frame, stamped with the seal of the Hillside Oaks Homeowners Association, HOA. A familiar annoyance flickered through him. Over the past few months, the HOA had been harassing him with petty fines. His grass was too tall. His trash bins were misaligned. His porch light was too bright. But this time, as he ripped the envelope open, the annoyance turned to something else. Rage. Dear Mr. Carter, this letter serves as notice that your pet, a golden retriever named Max, has been removed due to noncompliance with HOA regulations. Your dog was found in violation of Section 5.3, which limits pet breeds and sizes within the community. Failure to comply has resulted in immediate confiscation and relocation. Any further attempts to retrieve the animal will result in legal consequences and financial penalties. Daniel's breath hitched. Max was gone. His coffee cup slipped from his hand, shattering on the floor. He didn't even register the sound. His legs moved before his brain caught up, running to the backyard. The leash. The clasp was broken. The gate, usually locked, was wide open. They had taken his dog. Daniel stormed down the sidewalk, his pulse a thunderous drum in his ears. He knew exactly where to go, Gerald Whitmore's house. Gerald was the HOA president, a man who reveled in power. He wasn't just strict, he was malicious. Daniel had seen neighbors driven out of their homes over ridiculous violations, elderly residents bullied into selling their properties when they couldn't keep up with the constant fines. Gerald was a tyrant. Daniel didn't bother knocking. He pounded on the door with a force that rattled the frame. A few moments later, Gerald opened it, dressed in a robe, sipping his coffee. His expression didn't even register surprise, just amusement. Mr. Carter, Gerald said smoothly. To what do I owe the pleasure? Daniel's fists clenched. Where's my dog? Gerald took a slow sip. Ah, Max. Yes, he's been removed. HOA regulations clearly state. Cut the legal talk, Daniel snapped. That rule was never enforced before. You made this personal. Gerald sighed theatrically. Daniel, rules are rules. You're a lawyer. You, of all people, should understand that. Daniel took a step forward. Where is my dog? Gerald's smile widened. Relocated. Daniel's stomach dropped. To where? Gerald's gaze darkened. That information is not available to rule breakers. For a long moment neither man spoke. The air between them crackled with hostility. Then, Gerald leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. You should let this go, Carter. Daniel's entire body went cold. There was a threat buried in those words, clear as day. But Gerald didn't know who he was dealing with. Daniel drove straight to the county animal shelter, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The moment he stepped inside, the receptionist, a kind-eyed woman named Marie, looked up. Mr. Carter, right? Daniel's gut twisted. You know who I am? Marie hesitated, then nodded. Your dog was brought in earlier this morning by the HOA's private security. But, she swallowed, looking nervous. He's not here anymore. Daniel felt the world tilt. What do you mean? Marie lowered her voice. The HOA has an arrangement with a private facility. When pets are taken, they're transferred immediately. A sick feeling settled in Daniel's stomach. Where? Marie shook her head. I don't know. But you're not the first. Daniel leaned in. Tell me everything. Marie sighed. Over the past year, nearly a dozen pets have disappeared. Some neighbors paid fines to get them back, but others never saw them again. The HOA has full control. No one questions them. Daniel clenched his jaw. That changes today. As he left the shelter, Daniel noticed something strange. A black SUV parked across the street. It had been there when he arrived. Now, as he pulled out, the SUV followed. Daniel took a detour, weaving through side streets. The SUV stayed behind him. He wasn't just dealing with a corrupt HOA. He was being watched. When he finally reached home, his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. A distorted voice came through the line. "Drop it, Carter. This isn't a fight you can win." The call cut off. Daniel's grip tightened around the phone. They thought they could scare him. They thought wrong. Later that night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He sat on his porch, staring at the quiet street, his mind racing. Then movement. 2 figures in dark clothing crept along his property line. Daniel's pulse spiked. He slipped inside, grabbed his old baseball bat, and stepped back onto the porch, making sure the motion sensor lights flickered on. "Hey!" he barked. The figures froze. A split second later they bolted. Daniel chased them, but they were fast, too fast. They disappeared into the night. When he returned to his porch, his stomach twisted. A piece of paper had been nailed to his door. "Drop it, or you'll lose more than your dog." Daniel stood there for a long moment, his chest rising and falling with slow, controlled breaths. Then, he ripped the paper down and burned it. They had stolen Max. They had threatened him. They thought they were untouchable. They had no idea what was coming. Daniel didn't sleep that night. He spent hours in his home office, his desk littered with legal documents, old HOA contracts, and a notepad filled with every single HOA violation he could remember. This wasn't just about Max anymore. This was organized corruption. The HOA had a system in place, stealing pets, intimidating homeowners, enforcing non-existent rules to drive people out. Daniel had spent years in courtrooms exposing fraud, but he had never expected to be fighting this battle in his own neighborhood. He grabbed his laptop and pulled up Hillside Oaks HOA's bylaws. He had never read them in full before, most people didn't. But now, he was looking for loopholes. And that's when he saw it. Section 5.3, Restricted Pets. The HOA board retains the right to determine which animals pose a potential disturbance to the community. Any pets deemed disruptive will be subject to removal. That was it? No specifics? No actual breed restrictions? This wasn't a rule. This was a weapon, one the HOA had used to take Max. Daniel's fists clenched. He needed proof. The next morning, Daniel visited City Hall. If he wanted to take down Gerald and his corrupt HOA, he needed a paper trail. At the records office, a clerk named Lisa greeted him. "Can I help you?" Daniel nodded. "I need access to all complaints filed against Hillside Oaks HOA in the past 5 years." Lisa hesitated. "That's a lot of files." Daniel pulled out his lawyer's badge and placed it on the counter. "I'm not leaving without them." She sighed, then disappeared into the back. 10 minutes later, she returned with a thick stack of reports. Daniel sat down and started reading. Small Blue Diamond homeowners fined for non-existent violations. Small Blue Diamond elderly residents pressured into selling their homes. Small Blue Diamond pets mysteriously disappearing after disputes with the HOA. Small Blue Diamond security officers acting as enforcers, not protectors. His stomach churned. This was bigger than he thought. And then, he found it. A report from a former HOA board member, one who had resigned. "I can no longer be part of this corruption. Pets aren't just being removed, they're being sold to private buyers. The HOA president controls it all." Daniel's pulse pounded. Gerald wasn't just stealing pets. He was running an illegal operation. Daniel tracked down the former board member, Susan Weller, who had moved to a small rental property outside the neighborhood. When he knocked, she answered cautiously. The moment she saw him, fear flashed across her face. "I can't talk to you," she whispered, trying to close the door. Daniel stopped it with his foot. "I know what they're doing. And I know you do, too." Susan swallowed hard. "You don't understand. They took my dog." Daniel cut in. And I'm not leaving without answers. She hesitated, then let him in. The inside of her house was bare. No pictures, no decorations, like someone ready to leave at a moment's notice. Why did you resign? Daniel asked. Susan wrung her hands. Because I found out what they were doing. Gerald and the board, they have a deal with private buyers. Rich people who want purebred dogs. The HOA confiscates pets under fake rules, then sells them. Daniel's jaw tightened. Who's buying? Susan shook her head. I don't know names. Just that the transfers happen through a private facility outside town. Some kind of kennel. Daniel scribbled it down. Address? She hesitated. If I tell you, they'll know it came from me. Daniel met her gaze. Susan, they're going to keep doing this unless someone stops them. A long silence. Then she grabbed a piece of paper and wrote something down. Here. But be careful. You don't know how deep this goes. Daniel took the note. Now, he had a location. The address led Daniel to an industrial area on the outskirts of town. The facility was hidden behind a chain-link fence, topped with barbed wire. A weathered sign read, Summit Boarding and Training, Private Property. Daniel parked his car across the street, his heart pounding. If Max was here, this was his only shot. He grabbed a baseball cap and a clipboard from his car, just enough to look like an inspector. Then, he walked up to the front gate and buzzed the intercom. A gruff voice answered. We're closed. Daniel kept his voice firm. Animal Welfare Division. Routine inspection. A pause. Then, the lock buzzed open. Daniel stepped inside, every nerve on high alert. A man in a security uniform met him at the door. What's this about? Daniel handed him a fake inspection notice. Random compliance check. Shouldn't take long. The guard scowled but led him inside. The facility was eerily quiet. Rows of cages lined the walls, each containing purebred dogs. Some whined softly. Others pressed themselves against the bars, their eyes filled with fear. And then, Daniel saw him. Max. His golden retriever was huddled in the back of a cage, ears flattened, eyes dull. Daniel's breath hitched. They had drugged him. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay calm. If he acted now, he'd blow his cover. How often do these dogs get picked up? He asked casually. The guard shrugged. Depends. We get orders every couple weeks. Some rich guy in Florida just paid top dollar for a retriever. Daniel's stomach turned to ice. They were about to sell Max. He needed to act. Daniel left the facility, heart hammering. He had seen enough. He drove straight to the police station. If the HOA thought he was just a homeowner they could bully, they were dead wrong. He stormed inside and demanded to speak to Detective Eric Lawson, a former client, and one of the few officers he trusted. When Lawson saw the folder Daniel dropped on his desk, his eyebrows shot up. What am I looking at? Daniel's voice was deadly calm. A trafficking ring disguised as an HOA. Lawson flipped through the documents, the fraudulent fines, the missing pet reports, the testimony from Susan. His face darkened. You're telling me the HOA has been selling stolen pets? Daniel nodded. And I know where they're keeping them. Lawson exhaled sharply. All right. We'll put together a task force. But Daniel... He met his gaze. These people won't go down easy. Daniel's jaw tightened. I'm counting on it. That night, Daniel returned home feeling a grim satisfaction. The police were involved. The HOA was going down. But as he stepped onto his porch, he stopped cold. His front door was wide open. The lock had been smashed in. Daniel's stomach dropped. Someone had been inside. Heart pounding, he pushed the door open. His living room was trashed. Papers were scattered. His laptop was missing. And then, his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He answered, his grip like steel. A cold voice spoke. You should have stayed out of it, Carter. Click. Daniel stood there, breathing hard. They thought they could intimidate him. They were wrong. Because now? It was personal. Daniel stood in his trashed living room, his jaw clenched so tight it hurt. The intruders had left a message, loud and clear. Stay out of this. But all they did was fuel his fire. He wasn't just a homeowner fighting for his stolen dog. He was a lawyer with a vendetta, a man who had spent years in the courtroom dismantling frauds and exposing corruption. This was going to be their worst nightmare. Daniel grabbed his phone and dialed Detective Lawson. They broke into my house, he said coldly. Took my laptop, went through my files. They know I'm coming for them. Lawson swore. That proves they're hiding something. We're already looking into that kennel. But listen, Daniel, if they know what you're doing, they might try something worse. Daniel exhaled slowly. Let them try. I'm ready. If the HOA thought intimidation would stop him, they were dead wrong. Now, it was time to hit them where it hurt the most, legally. Daniel spent the entire night drafting the most devastating lawsuit of his career. Small Blue Diamond Claim 1. Fraud. The HOA had been fabricating violations and unlawfully seizing pets. Small Blue Diamond Claim 2. Embezzlement. The fines they collected weren't going toward community improvements, but were funneled into private accounts. Small Blue Diamond Claim 3. Property damage and trespassing. They had broken into Daniel's home. By morning, he had a 40-page legal document ready to file in civil court. Then, he called the press. Daniel knew that exposing corruption wasn't just about the courts, it was about public pressure. If enough people turned against the HOA, their power would crumble. He contacted a journalist he knew, Karen Wallace, a reporter who loved taking down corrupt organizations. Daniel Carter? She said when she picked up. Didn't expect to hear from you. What's the case? He smiled grimly. I have a story that's going to break the internet. Karen met him an hour later, and he laid everything out, the stolen pets, the fraudulent fines, the secret kennel, and the break-in at his home. When he was done, she sat back, eyes gleaming. This is going to make headlines. You ready for the storm? Daniel nodded. Bring it on. The next morning, the front page of the city's biggest news site had a headline in bold, all caps. Fire. Exclusive, HOA president accused of running illegal pet trafficking ring. By noon, the story was everywhere. News stations picked it up. Social media exploded. Hundreds of angry homeowners started sharing their own horror stories about the HOA. Daniel scrolled through the comments online. Pushpin. They took my cat 5 years ago. I thought it was just bad luck. Pushpin. That HOA has always been shady. Time for them to fall. Pushpin. Can someone check if Gerald is hiding bodies too? It was working. The public was turning against the HOA. But Daniel knew one thing for sure. Gerald wouldn't go down without a fight. It didn't take long for Gerald to fire back. The very next day, Daniel received a certified letter, a cease and desist order. It accused him of defamation and threatened him with legal action if he didn't retract his statements. Daniel laughed. That's all you got? He muttered, tossing the letter onto his desk. Then, his phone rang. Gerald. Daniel answered. Took you long enough. Gerald's voice was low and dangerous. You're playing with fire, Carter. This isn't a case you can win. Daniel smirked. You sound nervous. Gerald's tone darkened. Drop this now, and maybe I'll forget about what you did. Keep going, and I'll bury you. Daniel leaned back in his chair. You don't scare me, Gerald. But you know what does scare you? Silence. Daniel continued, voice cold. The Attorney General's office. I just sent them every piece of evidence I have. Fraud, embezzlement, racketeering. You're not just losing your HOA. You're going to prison. For the first time, Gerald hesitated. Then, the call disconnected. Daniel smirked. Checkmate. That same afternoon, Daniel received an email from an anonymous HOA board member. Envelope with arrow. Daniel, Gerald is losing control. The rest of us didn't know how deep this went. He told us everything was legal. We want out. Please help us. Daniel knew what this meant. The board was turning on Gerald. He replied instantly. Envelope with arrow. Meet me at my office. If you testify against him, I'll make sure you don't go down with him. 3 board members arrived at Daniel's office later that night. They looked scared. He lied to us, one said. We didn't know about the kennel, about the money. We just thought we were enforcing HOA rules. Daniel placed a recording device on the table. Tell me everything. For the next hour, they exposed Gerald's entire operation. Small Blue Diamond the bribes. Small Blue Diamond the fake fines. Small Blue Diamond the private accounts. And most importantly, Gerald was trying to flee. He's packing up his house, one of them admitted. Planning to disappear before the lawsuit hits. Daniel's blood boiled. Coward. Not happening, he muttered. The next morning, Daniel called Detective Lawson. He's trying to run, he warned. You need to move now. An hour later, police swarmed Gerald's house. The HOA president tried to slip out the back door with a suitcase, but officers tackled him before he got far. Small Blue Diamond charges: fraud, racketeering, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit theft. Small Blue Diamond maximum sentence: 25 years in prison. By noon, the news had spread. Gerald was in handcuffs. The HOA? Collapsed overnight. And Daniel? He was just getting started. The kennel was shut down. Dozens of stolen pets were recovered. But there was one thing left: Max. Daniel drove straight to the shelter where they were holding the confiscated dogs. When he stepped inside, a staff member smiled. You're Max's owner, right? Yeah, Daniel said, his voice tight. We've been waiting for you. She led him to the back. And there he was. Max sat in a kennel, looking thin and exhausted, but when he saw Daniel, his eyes lit up. He jumped up, tail wagging furiously, whining with excitement. Daniel dropped to his knees, arms open. Come here, boy. Max barreled into him, licking his face, whimpering with relief. Daniel buried his face in Max's fur. You're safe now, buddy. You're coming home. For the first time in days, he felt peace. The entire town was talking about it. The once feared HOA was collapsing like a house of cards, and Gerald, the arrogant, power-hungry president, was sitting in a jail cell, facing more charges than he could count. Daniel had won the first battle, getting Gerald arrested and dismantling the corrupt organization. But he wasn't done yet. He wasn't just here to defeat them. He was here to destroy them. And that meant making sure every single person involved paid the price. Daniel spent the next 3 days going through the HOA's financial records, collecting every document, every suspicious transaction, every fraudulent fine. Small Blue Diamond millions of dollars had been siphoned away. Small Blue Diamond hundreds of families had been robbed under fake violations. Small Blue Diamond dozens of stolen pets had disappeared, some never found. With Detective Lawson's help, he compiled the evidence into a full-scale federal case. Then, he called his old law school friend, Rebecca Stein. She was one of the toughest prosecutors in the state, and she loved nothing more than tearing corrupt organizations apart. You've got my attention, Daniel, she said, after looking at the files. This isn't just fraud. This is organized crime. Daniel nodded. And I want them all to go down. Rebecca smirked. Consider it done. She took the case straight to the state attorney general. Within 24 hours, the government was launching a full-blown investigation. Just when Daniel thought he had uncovered everything, something new came to light. One of the former HOA board members, Greg Fulton, contacted him. You need to see this, Greg whispered over the phone. Daniel met him in a dimly lit parking garage. Greg looked terrified. I found something Gerald was hiding, he said, handing Daniel a USB drive. Daniel plugged it into his laptop and scrolled through the files. And then, his blood ran cold. It wasn't just Gerald. The HOA had a silent partner, a real estate tycoon named Victor Langley. Victor wasn't just rich. He was powerful. And he had been using the HOA to intimidate homeowners, steal their pets, and force them to sell their properties at low prices. Then, he would buy the houses dirt cheap and flip them for millions. This wasn't just an HOA scam. It was a full-scale criminal empire. Daniel knew taking down Gerald was one thing. But taking down Victor Langley? That was dangerous. Victor had political connections, hired muscle, and a team of expensive lawyers. But Daniel wasn't backing down. He gathered everything: emails, contracts, recorded conversations. Then, he sent it to every major news outlet. The next morning, the news exploded. Loudspeaker breaking news: real estate mogul linked to HOA pet trafficking and fraud scandal. Social media erupted with outrage. Small Blue Diamond. This guy has been stealing from homeowners for years. Small Blue Diamond. This isn't just corruption, it's crime. Small Blue Diamond. How many families lost their homes because of this monster? People started protesting outside Victor's office. The FBI got involved. And within hours, Victor Langley was served with an arrest warrant. That night, Daniel watched the news as Victor was dragged out of his penthouse in handcuffs. It was over. The entire operation was shattered. The next day, Gerald cracked. Facing decades in prison, he agreed to a plea deal. He testified against Victor Langley, revealing every dirty deal, every stolen pet, every fraud scheme. It was the final nail in the coffin. Victor was sentenced to 35 years in federal prison. Gerald? Even with the plea deal, he still got 20 years. With the HOA dissolved and the criminals locked away, the neighborhood finally felt free. People celebrated in the streets. Daniel stood on his porch, watching Max run around the yard, truly safe for the first time. Then, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Detective Lawson. Envelope with arrow. Justice served. Take a break, Carter. You earned it. Daniel smiled. For the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. But deep down, he knew one thing. If anyone ever tried to pull something like this again, he'd be ready. With Victor Langley and Gerald locked away, the once oppressive HOA was completely dissolved. The tyranny that had controlled the neighborhood for years was over. And yet Daniel knew that justice wasn't just about sending people to prison. It was about restoring what was lost. And that meant making sure every single victim, every homeowner who had been robbed, every pet that had been stolen, got the justice they deserved. The first thing Daniel did after the case closed was help the local authorities track down the missing pets. Detective Lawson had raided the illegal pet trade operations that Victor and Gerald had been running, and they had rescued dozens of animals. Daniel, with the help of volunteers, worked tirelessly to return them to their rightful owners. Each reunion was heart-wrenching. Small Blue Diamond, an elderly woman breaking down in tears as she held her stolen cat for the first time in a year. Small Blue Diamond, a little boy screaming with joy when he saw his golden retriever run toward him. Small Blue Diamond families hugging their pets, crying, thanking Daniel over and over. And then, there was Max. Daniel had already gotten his beloved dog back, but as he watched the other families reunite, he couldn't help but kneel down and hold Max close. You did good, buddy, he whispered, rubbing behind his ears. Max barked happily, wagging his tail, free, safe, and home. Without the HOA, the neighborhood finally belonged to the people again. The unfair fines were wiped clean. The surveillance cameras that the HOA had installed were taken down. The ridiculous rules, no holiday decorations, no kids playing outside, no parking in your own driveway, were abolished. For the first time in years, people felt like they could breathe. They could live their lives without fear of getting a threatening letter or having their property taken away. One by one, neighbors started rebuilding what the HOA had destroyed. Small Blue Diamond families repainted their homes in the colors they loved. Small Blue Diamond kids rode their bikes down the street without fear. Small Blue Diamond community barbecues and block parties returned. It was a fresh start. And Daniel? He was finally at peace. One evening, as Daniel was sitting on his porch with Max, he received a surprise visit. Rebecca Stein, the prosecutor who had helped take down Victor, walked up to his house with a smirk. "You're a damn good lawyer, Carter," she said, sitting down beside him. Daniel chuckled. "I had a personal reason to win." Rebecca handed him a folder. "What's this?" he asked. "A job offer." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "I run a legal firm that specializes in cases like this," she said. "Corporate corruption, fraud, homeowners getting screwed over by the system. We could use someone like you." Daniel hesitated. For years, he had been working small cases, keeping his life quiet. But after everything he had been through, maybe it was time to use his skills for something bigger. Something that mattered. "You don't have to answer now," Rebecca said, standing up. "But think about it." Daniel watched as she walked back to her car, leaving him with the folder in his hands. And for the first time in a long time, he felt excited about what came next. Even though the fight was over, Daniel had one last thing to do. Victor Langley had been taken down. His real estate empire had crumbled. But there was still one last piece of poetic justice. Daniel used his legal expertise to buy Victor's mansion at a foreclosure auction. The same massive, luxurious home that Victor had built off the money he stole from hardworking families. It was now Daniel's. And what did he do with it? He donated it. He turned Victor Langley's former mansion into a community shelter for families who had been displaced by corrupt housing schemes. It became a safe haven, a place where people could get back on their feet. The media loved the story. Loudspeaker. Lawyer who took down corrupt HOA turns crook's mansion into shelter for the homeless. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. And Daniel? He had never felt more satisfied. Months passed, and life in the neighborhood returned to normal. Max had become a local celebrity, the dog who had unknowingly started a war against corruption. Daniel decided to take Rebecca's offer. He packed his bags, ready to start a new chapter in his life, helping people who had been wrong, just like he had been. But before he left, he took one last walk through the neighborhood, Max trotting beside him. He passed by the homes that had once lived in fear, now filled with laughter and light. He saw children playing freely where there had once been HOA enforcers lurking. And he knew that this battle had been worth it. He turned back to Max with a smile. "Ready for the next adventure, buddy?" Max wagged his tail, barking excitedly. Daniel chuckled. This wasn't just an ending. This was a new beginning.